With priests being preoccupied with the pursuit of power and wealth, their parishes were devoid of preaching. That skill was not even part of their training, and no one else was authorized to pick up the slack for them. This continued until the spread of heresy aroused the church from its slumber. When the preaching friars attempted to fill the void, they were thwarted at every turn. Not by the parishioners, but by the negligent priests. Although canon law was full of regulations regarding the fitness of prelates for office, they were ignored. No attention was paid to a candidate's abilities or qualifications. Instead, benefices were sold to the highest bidder or traded for favors. Rome had no interest in oversight or reform. Far from it. The Curia itself was enjoying the benefits of such corruption. They were always searching for opportunities to advance their own careers, and they were constantly writing to bishops demanding positions for their friends. It was common practice for prelates to hold more than one position, thus greatly enhancing their influence and income. Pluralities were a clear violation of canon law, but the Roman Curia was loath to enforce the law when they profited so handsomely from corruption. Learned doctors of theology stood in defense of such practices, declaring them lawful. Moralists' cries for reform fell on deaf ears. When a man purchased a benefice, it was strictly a business contract. He expected to do everything in his power to maximize the return on his investment. A neophyte priest was required to swear an oath to take full advantage of every possible opportunity to exploit his parishioners. Running a business left no time for tending to his pastoral duties. His primary source of revenue was the tithe, which was enforced with all the enthusiasm and ruthlessness of our modern IRS. The established formula for distribution of such revenue was this: the priest, the bishop, the church, and the poor would each receive 1/4. But in practice, the church received very little, and the poor received nothing at all. People in some places decided they had had enough of oppressive exactions and they refused to pay. Priest was pitted against parishioner, and it was not uncommon for more than one claimant to pursue the debtor. The church countered by declaring non-payment of tithes heresy. It has been estimated, perhaps an exaggeration, that there were some 60,000 tithe cases pending before the courts at the start of the French Revolution. However, even in more compliant communities, tithes were rarely sufficient to support the priest in the manner to which he had become, or wanted to become, accustomed. Some enterprising priests recognized that profit was to be gained from the confessional, which was now becoming mandatory for the faithful. They would grant absolution for any sin in exchange for a chicken or a pint of wine. Other priests demanded money to perform multiple masses for the soul of a confessor, deemed necessary for real or contrived infractions. Fees had to be paid in advance before the priest would perform wedding or funeral ceremonies. An oblation must be offered before a believer could receive communion. No priestly function was ignored as a source of revenue. When a man approached death, wary of impending judgment, especially after a life of wickedness or cruelty, the priest took full advantage of the opportunity. A generous contribution of land to the church for future pious uses was suggested as an appropriate atonement. Having no further use for it himself, and eager to escape harsh eternal judgment, it was usually an easy sell. It is well known that a large portion of the church's enormous wealth was derived from this tactic. That the disinherited heirs were left to a life of poverty and crime was of, at most, only tangential concern to the church. That preying on the simple and unlearned in their care was conduct unbecoming a member of the clergy never occurred to most prelates, and the few who did speak up were largely ignored. Squabbles frequently arose over the jurisdiction of a corpse. No priest wanted to miss his opportunity to collect generous sums for atonement, or oblations at the funeral, or fees for saying mortuary masses for the deceased soul. During this time, most countries owing obedience to the Latin Church had accepted celibacy in the priesthood. That, however, had not translated into chastity in the priesthood. If a priest could not have a wife, he had a concubine, or worse, a series of lovers. When the priest confessed his carnal transgressions, he was prohibited from giving the name of his partner. That was to prevent the confessing or confessor priest from blackmailing the female partner. It was also to prevent exposure of the scandal. The few scandals that did become common knowledge provoked intense antagonism. Female virtue was not a matter of great concern generally for that time, but the idea of a priest, claiming ascetic purity yet guilty of sexual impropriety, was sure to stir public outcry. So priests could do pretty much whatever they wanted to do without fear of punishment as long as they kept up appearances, and of course as long as they didn't marry. Sexual crimes were frequent, including in monasteries, where females were strictly forbidden. Probably the most profound and lasting damage to the church resulted from the false standard of morality imposed on the priesthood. Immunity from prosecution in secular courts plus the church's well-known leniency caused a great deal of hostility between the clergy and the laity. It also led to a demoralized clergy. It attracted to the clergy a class of men who were worthless and irresponsible, to the great detriment of all who came in contact with them. They had no empathy for commons who were subject to the terrors of the legal system. They had no regard for the teachings of Jesus, or the morals and values usually associated with Christianity. They enthusiastically used their position to prey upon the community. One of the methods they employed was the practice of buying doubtful claims from laymen. Since a cleric, whether plaintiff or defendant, had the right to refer civil cases to spiritual courts, which were strongly biased in his favor, he was assured a favorable verdict. And he was then free to collect the debt, no doubt with substantial interest. The threat of excommunication and eternal damnation was a far more effective motivation than broken kneecaps. The church's compliance in such schemes was strictly forbidden, of course, but that never stopped the clergy when a profit was to be made. More enterprising priests arranged to have the victim called to several spiritual jurisdictions simultaneously. It was of no concern to the spiritual authorities that compliance was physically impossible, or whether the defendant had even been properly served. Excommunication was the sentence, forcing the victim to pay for reconciliation as well as the original fine. Bear in mind that these victims were easy targets because they were illiterate, very simple people who were utterly defenseless. Excommunication was their greatest fear, considered a fate worse than death. Abbeys became centers of corruption. Nunneries became houses of prostitution. Monasteries became feudal castles where monks partied hardy and waged war on their neighbors. Notable exceptions were extremely rare. The vast majority of abbeys were sources of evil rather than good. Criminals often evaded punishment by agreeing to enter a monastery, resulting in monasteries serving as penal settlements or prisons. Each monk had a locked cupboard in the refectory to protect his cup, spoon, dish, and napkin from theft. Anti-theft measures were also necessary in the dormitory, if the monk could afford it. There were constant complaints about the thievish inclinations of fellow monks. There was a pattern of earnest reform efforts, inevitably followed by a return to indulgence and lack of monastic discipline. Much of the power and wealth of the church derived from its doctrine of justification by works. Absolution was easily obtained by a specified, by the priest, number of Pater Nosters or Ave Marias. If the penitent was unable or disinclined to pay the penalty himself, he might impose on family or friends to bear his burden for him, which deed magically transferred merit to the sinner as though among God's characteristics was that of supreme juggler. In preparation for Easter, the congregation was absolved as a whole, or in squads or batches by some careless priests, giving the impression to ignorant parishioners that it was a ceremony of magic. Salvation became more a matter of mechanical formula or magical incantation than repentance, a pure heart, an earnest struggle for a higher life through Christ. Uneducated, illiterate, and therefore easily manipulated and indoctrinated, those simple folks knew no better and had no reason to challenge the practices of the clergy. Christianity had been deprived of its spiritual vitality, which had been replaced by meaningless routine and dry formalism. The internal condition of the soul was of no concern to the clergy. It was to the laity, but only to the extent that they were able to avoid by whatever means necessary, eternal damnation. Incapable of higher abstract reasoning, they were content going along with the formulas established by the clergy. And so it was that they were suckers for another master scam, indulgences. It was an ancient and well-entrenched doctrine that sin could be absolved through confession, repentance, and penance. A natural appurtenance was the doctrine that penance could be achieved through service to the church. The church was regarded as the Fort Knox of the treasure of salvation, deposited by means of the crucifixion and the saints. The Pope, as God's supreme vicar, was also God's banker plenipotentiary, the final authority on who would be allowed to partake of this holy bounty and under what conditions. At first, penance for a specified time was suspended in exchange for pious works, pilgrimages to shrines, contributions toward church construction or bridges, etc. The Pope himself was not the only one who could transform spiritual punishment into mundane sacrifices. He could delegate that authority and responsibility to anyone he wanted. And there was no shortage of applicants, as it conferred upon them tremendous power and potential wealth. From there, it was a very short step to the principle of entire forgiveness for all sins through an indulgence. The Crusades provided the catalyst for the next step in the evolution of indulgences. If Muhammad promised his young warrior martyrs immediate bliss for their service and ultimate sacrifice to Allah, Christians had to compete effectively. They countered with an offer of eternal mercy for all their penitent crusaders. It was so popular that the offer was extended throughout all the Church's holy wars. Its attraction derived in part because it was well understood that even if a crusader survived the perils of battle, he would most likely return a broken bandit. As the initial thrill and excitement of crusading wore off, the Church needed to sweeten the deal to attract warriors. They decided to extend the offer of full remission of all sins to anyone who would pay the expenses of a crusader, and to anyone who would join a crusade at the expense of another. That left those earlier crusaders who had volunteered their services at their own expense with an acute case of remission envy. To assuage their sense of betrayal, the Church promised that they would receive more salvation than the others. No one in the Church could offer a coherent explanation of exactly how that was possible, but fortunately for them, they were not dealing with great minds. The Church's marketing department also enticed new recruits with the offer of pardon even for forgotten sins, as well as those which were remembered, confessed, and repented. But their crowning achievement was this gem. Crusaders were to be placed in the same class as clergy as regards both earthly and heavenly justice. In other words, crusaders got the same get-out-of-jail-free card that clerics had been enjoying. It goes without saying that the Crusades were not staffed with the best class of men. Which goes a long way toward explaining much of the conduct of crusaders and the final outcome of their efforts. A profitable device was invented which offered a reprieve to crusaders who, for whatever reason, found themselves unable or unwilling to complete their mission. All they had to do was pay whatever they could afford and they were off the hook. A great deal of revenue flowed into the Church coffers through this program. But it proved a bit cumbersome, and not quite up to the Pope's standards. So the Pope arranged for funds to flow directly to him. Revenue badly needed to finance his private wars. He ordered prelates everywhere to establish special coffers for this purpose. They obviously were not happy to be cut out of the deal, but there was nothing they could do about it. The next step in the evolution of indulgences was taken by churches and hospitals, who sent out pardoners armed with papal or episcopal letters. Cautiously framed, ambiguous enough to allow pardoners to promise for only a few small coins salvation for the living and liberation of the damned from hell. Needy bishops and popes were constantly selling such letters, spawning a new profession, that of professional pardoner. The most ruthless and shameless were also the most successful. As always, complaints fell on deaf ears, at least until Martin Luther. In the Church, prophet trumped God. Prophet, in fact, was God.